When Jessica was in university, she decided to take a summer job fighting forest fires. She left for the summer enthusiastic about the potential for money and getting into a different environment and being away from home for a while. Unfortunately, one day when she was driving her truck along a resource road, she had an accident. She lost control of her truck and was thrown from the vehicle. Jessica broke her back, and today she's a paraplegic. In the period between 2005 and 2009, there were almost 1,200 young workers who were injured as a result of being behind the wheel. In this period, there were also 7 young workers who were killed because they were operating a vehicle. When young workers are driving, there are several considerations that we need to make. First, what kind of vehicle are they used to driving? Most young workers are typically on a budget, and they may have a small economy car. And if you, as their employer or supervisor, are asking them to suddenly get into a truck and drive that truck across the yard, well, they may have their license and they may be willing to do that task. But if they have no experience in driving a larger vehicle, then their chance of putting themselves and anyone else on that work site at risk is much higher. So we need to consider the type of vehicles that young workers are used to driving before we ask them to do anything. We also need to consider the type of tasks that we're asking young workers to do when they're behind the wheel. For example, young workers may not be used to parallel parking. If they live in a suburban environment where they haven't had to practice their parallel parking skills, and the only time that they've done it is in order to get their license, and we go and ask them in the context of work to go parallel park, then we need to make sure that our young workers are trained properly to do the tasks that we're asking them to do. We also need to consider the type of conditions that young workers are exposed to when they're behind the wheel. If we have a young worker who has only been driving for a year and they haven't had experience in snowy conditions, for example, and we have sent them off to a work site up north where there's snow and ice on the road and we haven't given them proper training or orientation, we need to consider that. We need to make sure that new and young workers are trained and oriented properly to use the types of vehicles that they're being asked to use. It's easy to think of the driving risks associated for a young worker who is a pizza delivery driver, for whom driving is the main function of their job. And often when that's the case, as a parent or as an employer, we've talked to them to make sure that they have the proper training and they're accustomed to what they're doing. But we need to think about young workers for whom driving isn't their primary job, but who, for on an odd occasion, we may ask to move a vehicle, to move it from one side of a yard or not, or to take the truck to one location or the other. Even on these ad hoc, one-off, small requests, we need to make sure that young workers have been given the proper orientation and training, and that they know how to drive that vehicle, and they can demonstrate that they can drive that vehicle safely. We often think of vehicles in terms of cars or trucks, but in fact there are all kinds of other vehicles that young workers are exposed to, and unfortunately, vehicles that cause serious young worker injuries. These are things such as forklifts, snowmobiles, and cranes.